The notice had been nailed to the post outside Harker's General Store for 3 days before anyone stopped laughing long enough to actually read it. Seeking wife. Must be willing to work. No complaints. No expectations of softness. Fair treatment guaranteed. Apply in person at the Drummond Ranch 15 miles north. Crude. Direct. The kind of thing that made the church ladies clutch their shawls and the men snicker into their beards. Silas Drummond, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, 240 pounds of muscle and silence, had finally cracked. The giant was lonely. Colette Weston read it on a Tuesday morning while carrying a tray of burnt rolls back to the kitchen. She had ruined them on purpose. Not out of spite, though she had plenty of reasons for that. She had ruined them because Mrs. Pendleton, who owned the bakery where Colette worked 16 hours a day for pennies in a backroom cot, had a particular talent for cruelty disguised as commerce. She skimmed the good bread, sold Colette's mistakes at full price, docked Colette's pay for every imperfection real or invented, while pocketing the difference with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had turned exploitation into an art form. The burnt ones went to the pigs. Colette went hungry. It was a small rebellion burning those rolls, the kind that cost her more than it cost anyone else. But some days, a person needed to feel like they had made a choice, even a bad one, even one that left her stomach growling against her ribs like something trapped. She stopped in front of that notice. Snow was melting into her thin coat, soaking through the worn wool until the cold pressed against her skin like a second layer of clothing, one designed not for warmth, but for punishment. She read the words once quickly, then again slower, then a third time with the kind of desperate attention a drowning woman gives to a piece of driftwood floating just within reach. No one noticed her standing there. They never did. Colette had perfected the art of being invisible over years of careful, relentless practice. Mousy brown hair always covered by a kerchief, eyes down, shoulders curved inward, like she was apologizing for taking up space in a world that had not asked for her opinion and certainly had not asked for her presence. 26 years old, and she had already lived a lifetime of making herself smaller. The voice came from behind her, sharp as a slap. "Pathetic, isn't it?" Colette did not turn. She recognized the voice, the way you recognize the sound of a door slamming in a house where doors slam often. Vivian Hale, the banker's daughter, a woman who had opinions about everything and the social standing to voice them all without consequence. Vivian moved through the world like it owed her something, and most of the time the world agreed and paid up. A man like that thinking any decent woman would consider it. Vivian lowered her voice to a scandalous whisper, the kind engineered to carry exactly as far as the speaker intended. "They say he killed a man in Wyoming with his bare hands, just snapped his neck like kindling." "I heard he doesn't talk," her companion added. "Margaret Flynn, the doctor's wife, a woman who collected other people's tragedies the way some women collected china plates. Won't say more than 10 words a week. What kind of marriage is that? The kind no sane woman would want." Vivian laughed, a bright cutting sound that scattered across the morning air like broken glass thrown on a hardwood floor. "Though I suppose the desperate ones might consider it. The ones with nowhere else to go." They walked away, still laughing, their boots crunching through the thin crust of ice on the boardwalk. Neither of them had noticed Colette standing there, and why would they? She was invisible. She was nothing. She was exactly the kind of desperate woman Vivian was talking about. Colette stared at the notice until the words blurred, until the cold made her fingers ache and her toes went numb inside boots that had more holes than leather. Desperate. Yes, that was exactly what she was. She had spent so long avoiding the word, dancing around it, finding softer ways to describe her situation, getting by, managing, making do. But standing here in the November cold with snow melting through her coat and an empty stomach growling beneath her ribs, she could not pretend anymore. The mathematics of her life were simple and brutal, and they did not lie. She was 26, unmarried, unskilled except for baking. She had exactly $4.30 to her name. Her mother had died of cholera when she was 14, her father before that when she was 7, no siblings, no family, no one who would notice if she disappeared tomorrow or next week or ever. In another year, maybe 2, she would be too old for even this miserable work. Mrs. Pendleton would replace her with someone younger, someone who could work longer hours for even less pay. And then what? The cribs down by the railroad, begging, the charitable home for destitute women where they made you pray for your supper and treated gratitude like currency you could never earn enough of. She had heard the stories about Silas Drummond, same as everyone. He had shown up in Montana Territory 5 years ago with enough cash to buy the old Henderson spread. 2,000 acres of rough country that broke lesser men. The Henderson family had worked that land for a decade and surrendered. The wife took the children back east. The husband drank himself into a grave that the Montana winter filled with snow. Drummond bought it for a fraction of its worth and proceeded to do what the Hendersons could not. He tamed it, built it up, made it work, turned 2,000 acres of stubborn earth and hostile weather into something that functioned, that produced, that survived, kept to himself, paid his bills in silver, came to town once a month for supplies, and did not speak unless spoken to first. When he did speak, his voice was low and measured the voice of a man who had learned that words had weight and should not be wasted on people who would not feel it. People said he had done time in prison. People said he had been a cavalry soldier who had seen things in the frontier campaigns that still woke him up screaming. People said he had loved a woman once, and she had died badly, and he had carried her body 20 miles through a blizzard to bury her proper. People said he had scars on his back that told a story he never shared. People said a lot of things. Most of it was probably garbage, but one thing everyone agreed on. Silas Drummond did not lie. If he posted a notice promising fair treatment, he meant it. If he said no expectations of softness, he meant that too. The man's word was iron, and iron does not bend for convenience. Colette made her decision that night. She was lying on the cot in the bakery's storage room. The cot was narrow and lumpy. The blanket was thin enough to see through in places. The room smelled permanently of yeast and old flour, a smell that had worked its way so deeply into her skin that she suspected she would carry it with her for the rest of her life, however long or short that turned out to be. Mrs. Pendleton had docked her a full day's wages for the burnt rolls. Money Colette had already spent on medicine for her boarding house neighbor's sick child. A boy named Thomas, 4 years old, with a cough that rattled in his chest like stones in a tin can. His mother worked at the laundry and could not afford the tincture the doctor prescribed. Colette could not afford it either, but she had bought it anyway because what was the alternative? Listening to the boy cough through the thin walls all night, knowing she could have helped and chose not to. She sat up in the dark. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs and made herself breathe. In, out, slow, steady. the way her mother had taught her to breathe through pain back when pain was just a scraped knee back before the world had shown her what real pain looked like. She had spent her entire life doing what she was supposed to do, obeying, shrinking, accepting whatever scraps people threw her way, and being grateful for them, smiling when she wanted to scream, saying thank you when she wanted to say something far less polite. And where had it gotten her? Here, alone, hungry, invisible, living in a storage room, sleeping on a cot that made her back ache, working for a woman who treated her like furniture, useful but not worth maintaining. The desperate ones might consider it, Vivian had said, the ones with nowhere else to go. Fine. Colette was desperate, but she was also done apologizing for it. She left before dawn. The bakery was dark and silent. Mrs. Pendleton still asleep in her comfortable apartment above the shop where she slept on a real mattress under a proper quilt, never once wondering whether the girl in the back room had enough blankets to survive the November night. Colette moved through the kitchen by memory, her hands finding the familiar landmarks: the edge of the counter, the handle of the flour bin, the hook where her coat hung. She took only what fit in a canvas sack. 2 dresses, one so worn at the elbows the fabric had turned translucent. A hairbrush with half its bristles missing. The silver locket her mother had given her before the cholera took everything, the locket and the memory inside it, the only inheritance Colette would ever receive. $3.10. She left the remaining $1.20 on Mrs. Pendleton's counter with a note that said only 2 words: I quit. It was the most satisfying sentence she had ever written. The walk to Drummond Ranch took 4 hours. Her boots were not meant for this kind of distance. They were not meant for much of anything, really, held together by stubbornness and a prayer and the residual memory of having once been actual footwear. She could feel blisters forming before she had cleared the first mile hot spots of friction that would become raw wounds by the 2nd mile and open sores by the 3rd. The November cold cut through her coat like she was not wearing one at all, finding every gap, every worn patch, every place where the wool had thinned to almost nothing. The road wound north through a landscape that was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, sharp, indifferent, capable of cutting you without noticing. Twice she almost turned back. The first time was at the 2-mile mark. A gust of wind hit her so hard she staggered sideways and nearly fell into the ditch that ran alongside the road. The cold was so intense it felt personal, like the weather itself had formed an opinion about the foolishness of her plan and was expressing it with conviction. She stood there for a full minute shaking, the canvas sack banging against her hip, her nose running, her eyes watering, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and go back to the bakery, back to the storage room, back to the miserable certainty of a life she understood. But turning back meant Mrs. Pendleton, meant docked wages, meant slow starvation disguised as employment, meant being invisible until she finally disappeared entirely, and nobody would notice when she did. She kept walking. The second time was at the 3-mile mark when the road climbed a ridge and she could see the vast expanse of snow-covered wilderness stretching out in every direction like a wide ocean with no horizon and no shore. She was so small against it. A speck of a woman in a thin coat walking toward the home of a man she had never met, carrying everything she owned in a bag that weighed less than a sack of flour. What was she doing? What in God's name was she doing? But she kept walking, because at this point turning back meant she had suffered 3 miles of misery for nothing. At least this way, if she failed, it would be because she had tried something, chosen something. At least the failure would be hers. The ranch appeared just after noon. It sprawled across a valley between two ridges of pine, like something that had grown there rather than been built, and Colette stopped walking, stopped breathing, because what she saw was not what she had expected. She had expected a desperate homestead, a ramshackle collection of lean-tos held together with rope and hope, the kind of place a lonely, dangerous man would inhabit. Dark, neglected, a reflection of the man the town whispered about. Instead, she saw this. A main house, sturdy and square, built from logs fitted together with a precision that spoke of patience and skill, and a fundamental refusal to accept anything less than right. A barn that looked new, the wood still pale and unweathered. Fencing that ran straight and tight across the pasture, the posts driven deep into the frozen ground with the authority of someone who intended them to stay there for a very long time. Cattle dotting the far field, fat and healthy, their breath steaming in the cold air like small prayers, rising toward a sky that probably was not listening but received them anyway. This was not some desperate homestead. This was a working ranch, a successful one, built and maintained by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it well and did not need anyone's approval or permission to do it. Colette almost ran. What was she thinking? A man with property like this could have his pick of wives, real wives, competent ones, women who knew how to ride and rope and manage livestock, women with dowries and connections and skills that went beyond making bread rise. He did not need a scrawny baker with $4 to her name and blisters on both heels and a coat that was more holes than fabric. But she had walked 4 hours, and she was tired of running, from problems, from fear, from herself. If she was going to be rejected, she wanted it to be face to face, wanted to look the rejection in the eye instead of imagining it from the safety of a bakery storage room. She made it halfway across the yard before the door opened. Silas Drummond was bigger than she had imagined. Not just tall, though he had to duck slightly coming through the doorway, but broad in a way that suggested he had built this place with his own hands, and those hands could break most things they touched. Dark hair that needed cutting. Dark eyes that missed nothing. A jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind the ranch. His face looked like it had forgotten how to arrange itself into anything approaching friendly. There were lines around his eyes not from smiling, from squinting into distance, from wind and sun, from whatever he had seen in whatever life he had lived before this one. He did not smile, did not speak, just stood there and looked at her with an expression she could not read, not hostile, not welcoming, assessing, the way a man might look at a piece of land he was considering buying, checking the soil before committing. Colette forced herself to stand straight, to meet his eyes. She was shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from the terrifying reality of what she was doing. But she did not let herself look away. "I'm here about the notice," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which felt like a small miracle. "For the wife position." Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, more like reassessment, as though she had said something that did not match whatever calculation he had been running. "You walked here," he said, not a question. "Yes." "From town?" "Yes." He studied her for another long moment, and Colette had the uncomfortable sensation of being inventoried, not in the way men usually looked at women. There was nothing improper in his gaze, no leering, no appraisal of anything other than capability. He was taking stock, measuring, weighing her against some standard she could not see. "You're underdressed for the cold," he said finally. "I know. Your boots are coming apart at the seams. I know that too. Why did you come?" The honest answer would have been simple and ugly. Because I am desperate and you are my last option. Because I have $4 and no future, and the alternative is slow death by starvation and invisibility. Because everyone in town thinks I am pathetic, and maybe they are right, but I would rather be pathetic in trying than pathetic in surrendering. But Colette had learned long ago that men did not want honesty. They wanted flattery, submission, whatever made them feel bigger. They wanted to hear that they were chosen, not that they were settled for. Except Silas Drummond had put no complaints, no expectations of softness in his notice. Maybe he was different. Maybe just this once she could try telling the truth and see what happened. "Because everyone in town thinks you're crazy for posting that notice," Colette said. "And everyone thinks I'm pathetic for considering it. I figured that made us even." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. The ghost of one like he had forgotten how to do it properly and was working from an old memory that had faded around the edges. "Come inside," he said, stepping back from the doorway. "You'll freeze if you stand out here much longer." The house was warmer than she expected. A fire already burning in the stone hearth, the kind of fire that had been built by someone who understood heat. Not flashy, not wasteful, just steady and hot, radiating warmth through the room like a heartbeat. The floors were clean, not obsessively so, but organized in a way that spoke of purpose. Everything had a place, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. Every item in the room existed because it served a function, and it was positioned where it could best serve that function. There was something almost military about it, and she would later learn that was exactly right. He gestured to a chair at the table. "Sit." She sat. He moved to the stove, poured coffee into 2 tin cups, brought them to the table, set one in front of her without ceremony, without asking whether she wanted it, without the performative politeness that most people used as a substitute for actual consideration. The coffee was black as coal, and strong enough to strip paint off a barn wall. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. "You got a name?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. It creaked under his weight. "Colette Weston. Family." "No. My mother died when I was 14. Father before that. No one." He nodded, like this was information rather than tragedy. "Job. I worked at Pendleton's bakery. I quit this morning." "You know what people say about me?" "Yes." "You believe it?" Colette considered that. She owed him honesty. He seemed like the kind of man who could smell a lie the way some people could smell rain coming. "I believe some of it's probably true," she said. "I don't know which parts." "Fair enough." He took a sip of coffee, still watching her over the rim. "What do you think you know about ranching?" "Nothing." "Cooking?" "Some. I'm better at baking than cooking, but I can learn." "Horses?" "I've never touched one." "Cattle?" "Same." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time something like amusement crossed his face. Not mockery. She would have recognized mockery immediately, but genuine amusement, the kind that came from surprise. "So you can't ride, can't rope, don't know cattle, and you walked 4 hours in bad boots to apply for a job you're not qualified for." He paused. "That about right. That's about right." "Why?" There it was again. That direct, uncompromising demand for honesty, no softening, no social lubrication, just the question stripped to its bones. Because I'm 26 years old and I've spent my entire life being useful to other people, she said. I've worked since I was 12, worked hard, and I've got nothing to show for it except $4 in calluses. In town, I'm nobody. I'll always be nobody. But you posted a notice that said you wanted a wife who could work, and I can work. Maybe I can't do what you need yet, but I can learn, and I will learn, because I'm tired of being invisible. The silence stretched out between them. The fire crackled. The wind moaned against the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse nickered. I'm not looking for love, he said finally. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can handle the isolation, the work, the winters. This isn't a romance. I know. Fair treatment doesn't mean easy treatment. Life out here is hard. Life in town is hard too. At least here I'd own it. He nodded. Not enthusiastically, not grudgingly, just a decision made and a course set. All right, here's how this works. You stay for 1 week. You see the ranch. You see the work. You see what it's actually like. At the end of the week, you decide if you can do this. I decide if I think you can too. We both have to agree or it's over. And if it's over, I'll give you money for the stage back to wherever you want to go. Fair. One more thing. His voice went quieter but somehow harder. I don't hit women. Not for any reason. You don't have to be afraid of me that way. But I also don't tolerate lying or stealing. You do either of those things, we're done. Understood. He stood, extended his hand. Then we have a deal. Colette stood too, taking his hand. His grip was careful, controlled. The handshake of a man who knew his own strength and kept it leashed, who understood that the power in those scarred, calloused hands was not something to be demonstrated, but managed. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Silas said. You haven't seen the work. He was not exaggerating. The first day he woke her before dawn. She was sleeping in the spare room, small but clean. A real bed with wool blankets that felt like luxury after months on the bakery cot. His knock came at the door, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory flooded back. The walk, the ranch, the handshake. Time to start, Silas said through the door. No good morning, no sleep well, just the information and the expectation that she would meet it. He walked her through the morning routine without preamble. Feed the horses, 3 of them, large and intimidating, their breath steaming in the pre-dawn darkness. Check water troughs, which meant breaking the overnight ice with a heavy iron bar, swinging it until her shoulders burned. Milk the cow, a patient brown creature named Bessie, who regarded Colette with supreme indifference and kicked the bucket twice before Colette figured out the rhythm. Gather eggs from chickens who seemed personally offended by her existence. Chop kindling. Start breakfast. By the time the sun was fully up, her back was screaming and her hands were numb. Breakfast was burned bacon and lumpy oatmeal. She stared at the plate she had prepared with something approaching despair. She could bake bread that made grown men close their eyes in pleasure, could produce pastries so flaky they seemed to defy physics. But put her in front of a stove with a skillet, and she produced charcoal. Silas ate it without complaint. Every bite, methodically, without expression. Like a man who had eaten worse and had stopped having opinions about food somewhere around the 3rd year of cavalry rations. Tomorrow you'll do better, he said when the plate was clean. And somehow it did not sound like criticism. It sounded like faith. The days blurred together, each one a marathon of physical labor that left Colette so exhausted she fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. Silas taught her to ride, badly at first, every muscle in her body screaming in protest, the horse clearly aware it was carrying someone who had no idea what she was doing and treating her with tolerant contempt. Then, slightly less badly, as her muscles adapted and she learned to move with the animal instead of against it. He taught her to read cattle behavior, how a cow that separated from the herd might be sick, how a bull pawing the ground was not being playful, how to mend fence, how to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg. 100 small essential skills that added up to the knowledge required to keep a ranch running through a Montana winter. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience, just demonstrated once, then let her try, correcting with a brief, precise instruction when she got it wrong, nodding when she got it right. That nod was his highest form of praise. That small, almost imperceptible dip of the head that said, "Good, you are learning, keep going." In the evenings after the work was done, and the fire was built, and the house settled into the particular quiet of a winter night, they sat on opposite sides of the table and he answered her questions. About the ranch, about Montana, about practical things like winter preparation and market prices, and the best way to predict a storm by watching the animals. She learned that he had been a cavalry soldier stationed out west during the frontier campaigns, that he had left after his enlistment ended because he was tired of taking orders from men who had never seen the things he had seen and would not have understood them if they had, that he had worked as a ranch hand in Wyoming for 3 years after saving every penny, sleeping in bunkhouses and eating trail food, living like a monk so that someday he could buy land of his own. She learned that he had built this house himself, log by log, 2 full summers of cutting and fitting and raising walls, learning as he went, making mistakes and fixing them. Stubborn enough to keep going when most men would have given up and hired someone who knew what they were doing. She learned that he liked his coffee black and his mornings quiet, that he read books, not dime novels, histories and accounts of exploration, that he kept them on a shelf by his bed, the spines worn soft from rereading, that he had posted the notice because he was tired of doing everything alone, because a ranch this size needed 2 people, because he had reached 34 and started thinking about legacy, about what would happen to this place when he was gone. "I'm not good with people," he admitted one night staring into the fire. "Never have been. Don't know how to make small talk or court proper. Figured I'd just be direct about what I needed. Probably sounds cold." "It sounds honest," Colette said. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, more worn down, someone who'd already given up and was just going through the motions." "I am worn down," Colette said quietly. "I'm just good at hiding it." "Yeah," Silas said softly, his eyes returning to the fire. "I can see that." On the 5th day, everything changed. They had ridden out to check the north fence line. A long ride, 3 hours each way through country that was beautiful in a harsh way, the kind of beauty that did not care whether you appreciated it or not. Mountains in the distance, white-capped and enormous. Skies so big it made Colette dizzy. The air cold and sharp, scented with pine and snow, and the particular clean emptiness of high country. Colette's riding had improved enough that she could stay in the saddle without constantly worrying about falling off. Silas rode beside her easy and relaxed his body, moving with the horse like they were one creature. She envied him that effortless competence. They were checking the fence line, working their way along it, looking for breaks. The afternoon light was fading, and the temperature was dropping fast. They needed to head back. Then it happened. Silas's horse stepped onto a patch of ice hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. The animal's legs went out from under it. In a different situation, Silas might have been thrown clear, but his boot caught in the stirrup as the horse went down, and 1,200 pounds of animal rolled onto his right leg with a sound that Colette would never forget. A crack. Not bone, thank God. The ice beneath them. But the horse was panicking, thrashing, and Silas was trapped underneath his face, white with pain, unable to free himself. Colette had never faced anything like this. She had never been alone on horseback for more than 20 minutes. She had never dealt with a panicking horse. She had no rope skills, no experience, no training for this. What she had was the same thing she had always had. The thing that had kept her alive through 16-hour days and starvation wages and Mrs. Pendleton's cruelty. The ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. The patience and precision that came from years of baking, from measuring and timing and understanding that panic ruined bread the same way it ruined everything else. She dismounted. Carefully, slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice to Silas's horse, the way she had heard Silas speak to nervous animals. Not the words, the tone. Calm, rhythmic, like a lullaby for something that could kill you. The horse stopped thrashing, breathing hard, eyes rolling, but listening. Colette moved to where Silas was pinned. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. "Don't try to move," she said. Wasn't planning on it. His voice was tight with pain. "My leg. It's not broken, I don't think, but I can't get leverage." She assessed the situation the way she would assess a bread that had gone wrong. What was the problem? What were the tools available? What was the sequence of actions that would produce the desired result? She needed to get the horse up. The horse needed to feel safe enough to stand. For that, she needed it calm. She needed its trust. Colette spent 10 minutes talking to the horse. Just talking. Her voice steady and quiet, her hand on its neck feeling the muscles tremble beneath the sweat-soaked coat. She talked about bread, about the difference between sourdough and wheat, about how you had to be patient with yeast, how you could not rush it, how the secret to good bread was knowing that the dough would rise in its own time, and no amount of pushing would make it happen faster. The horse calmed. Then she took the reins and urged it up, gently, firmly, using her weight and her voice and the horse's own desire to be standing rather than lying on cold ground. It took 3 tries. On the third, the horse lurched to its feet, and Silas's leg was free. He could not stand on his own. The leg was badly bruised, maybe a cracked bone. He could barely put weight on it. And they were 3 hours from the ranch. The light was fading, and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that killed people who were not paying attention. Colette helped him onto her horse. It took everything she had. He was 240 pounds of muscle and stubbornness, and he kept trying to help, which made everything harder. She finally told him to stop moving and let her handle it, and something in her voice, something she did not know she possessed, made him listen. She led both horses back toward the ranch. On foot, in boots that were already coming apart, through gathering darkness and deepening cold, following the trail by instinct and by the fading light on the snow and by the particular angle of the ridgeline against the sky that Silas had taught her to navigate by just 2 days ago. It took 4 hours. The darkness was complete by the second hour. The cold was beyond anything she had experienced. Her hands were numb. Her feet were numb. Her face felt like it belonged to someone else. But she kept walking, kept leading the horses, kept talking to the animals, and to Silas, and to herself, because the sound of her own voice was the only thing keeping the fear at bay. When they finally reached the ranch, Colette got Silas inside and onto the bed and built up the fire and heated water and found the liniment he kept for the horses and used it on his leg because it was the closest thing to medicine available. And she did all of this without stopping, without thinking, without letting the enormity of what had happened and what could have happened catch up to her. When it was done, when Silas was warm and his leg was wrapped and the horses were put up and the fire was burning steady, Colette sat down in the chair by the hearth and her hands started shaking. Silas watched her from the bed. His expression was different now. Something had changed behind those dark eyes. Something fundamental. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I did what needed doing," Colette said. She was trying to keep her voice steady, but the shaking had spread from her hands to her whole body, and she could not make it stop. "Nobody told you to do that. Nobody showed you how. You figured it out yourself in the dark and the cold, with a panicking horse and a man twice your size who couldn't help himself." He paused. "That's not just doing what needed doing. That's something else." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the kind of person I need. The kind who doesn't wait to be told, who sees the problem and handles it, who doesn't quit when it gets hard." Colette felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the cold that still gripped her body. Not pride exactly, something deeper, the unfamiliar sensation of being recognized. "Does this mean I passed the test?" she asked. "There was never a test," Silas said. "There was just the work, and you showed up for it." The next morning Silas could barely walk. He leaned on a crutch he had fashioned from a branch and tried to do his morning routine, and Colette told him to sit down and eat his breakfast and let her handle it. He sat down. He ate his breakfast. He let her handle it. And Colette Weston, who had never milked a cow before 1 week ago, who had never touched a horse, who had never set foot on a ranch, ran the Drummond spread by herself for 2 days, while the man who owned it watched her from the porch and tried to figure out how a scrawny baker from town with $4 and terrible boots had become the most capable person he had ever met. On the evening of the 6th day, Silas told her he had something to say. They were sitting by the fire. His leg was better still stiff, but bearing weight. Colette was mending a shirt she had torn on a fence post, her fingers moving with the quick precision that came from years of detail work. "I've been thinking about the end of the week," Silas said carefully, "about whether this arrangement makes sense." Colette set down the shirt. Here it came. The speech. "Thank you for your help, but I need someone with experience. You should go back to town. I'll give you money for the stage. I think," Silas continued, "that you should take some more time to consider. This life, it's not what you're used to. It's hard and it's lonely, and the winters can break a person if they're not built for it. You've had 1 week. That's not enough to know." Colette looked at him, and then she did something she had never done before in her 26 years of obeying and shrinking and accepting. She interrupted a man who was telling her what to do. "I don't need more time," she said. "I've already decided." Silas blinked. "I walked 4 hours in boots that were falling apart because I was tired of being invisible. I learned to milk a cow and ride a horse, and I dragged you home through the dark when your horse went down. I know what this life is. I've been living it for a week, and it's harder than anything I've ever done, and I want it more than anything I've ever wanted." She held his gaze. "The question isn't whether I've decided. The question is whether you have." The silence stretched between them. Silas Drummond had spent 5 years alone on this ranch. He had built the house with his own hands, raised the barn, strung the fences, tended the cattle. He had survived winters that killed other men and summers that baked the earth to cracking and spring floods that washed away months of work. He had done all of it alone because he had believed with the iron certainty that defined everything about him that alone was the only way he knew how to function. And now this woman, this small, fierce, determined woman who had walked into his life with nothing but $4 and stubbornness, who had saved his life with a calm voice and a steady hand, who was sitting in his chair in his house looking at him with eyes that did not look away and telling him that she had already decided. "Yeah," he said finally. Something shifted in his face, something that looked like the first crack in a wall that had been standing for a very long time. "I've decided too. We'll go to town tomorrow, get the license." "That fast?" "You want a courtship? I can recite some poetry if you want." "Can you actually recite poetry?" "No." Colette laughed. It surprised her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that, sudden and real and unguarded. Silas's mouth twitched in response, that almost smile that she was learning to recognize as his version of genuine warmth. "I need respect," she said, sobering. "Partnership, fair treatment. Then that's what you'll get. One more thing. That notice said no expectations of softness. I need to know what you meant by that." "I meant the work, not how I'd treat you." His voice went quiet. "You understand?" She understood. And something caught in her chest, a feeling she had forgotten existed, the feeling of being safe. They rode to town the next morning. The courthouse was a squat brick building at the edge of town. Judge Crawford handled marriages and land disputes with equal measures of boredom and formality. He looked up when they entered. Surprise, confusion, poorly concealed amusement. "Drummond," he said. "Miss Weston, what can I do for you?" "We need a marriage license," Silas said. Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Miss Weston, are you being coerced?" "No," Colette said firmly. "I'm choosing." Something like respect crossed Crawford's face. The process took 20 minutes. Paperwork, signatures, brief vows that felt more contractual than romantic. Crawford pronounced them married with all the enthusiasm of a man recording a property deed. They walked out into the cold sunlight as husband and wife. They were halfway to the horses when Vivian Hale appeared, flanked by 2 companions, the judgment committee assembled and ready. "Colette," Vivian said, dripping false sweetness, "surely you didn't actually—" "We got married, just now." Vivian's smile froze. "You can't be serious. I imagine people will say the same things they've always said, that I'm desperate and he's dangerous." Colette met Vivian's eyes and did not look away. "But the difference is I don't have to listen anymore." She walked past Vivian and mounted her horse, with only a little awkwardness. She was still learning, but she managed it, and she did not fall. And that was enough. They stopped at the general store for supplies. The whispers started immediately. "Can you believe? Give it 3 months. Absolute scandal." Silas ignored it all methodically, working through his list. But Colette felt every stare. Then Harlan Burke approached. The town's wealthiest rancher. Money from inheritance. Success from sharp dealing. He had never liked Silas. Too much competition from a man with no pedigree. "Callahan," Burke said. "Heard you got yourself a wife." "News travels fast. This man is not what he pretends to be," Burke said to Colette, his voice slick with false concern. "He showed up here with money no working man should have. He keeps to himself because he's hiding something, and now he's convinced some desperate girl to—" "That's enough," Silas said quietly. The words were not loud, were not threatening in any obvious way, but the temperature around them seemed to drop. Burke took a step back. He was afraid, genuinely afraid. Silas had not raised his voice, had not moved, but he had filled the space between them with something that made a powerful man retreat. They rode home in silence. Colette kept watching her new husband, trying to reconcile the patient man who ate her burned bacon with the one who had made Harlan Burke back down with 3 words. "What Burke said about the money," she began. "I saved it, every penny. 6 years of soldier's pay, 3 more working ranches in Wyoming. I didn't steal it." "I believe you." "Why?" "Because if you were the kind of man who took what didn't belong to him, you would have treated me differently this week. You gave me a choice. Men who steal don't do that." His expression softened slightly. "You're smarter than people give you credit for." "Most people don't give me any credit at all." Their loss, that night, lying in her small room, still hers, still separate. Colette stared at the ceiling and marveled at the strange turn her life had taken. 1 week ago, she had been invisible, desperate, slowly starving in a back room while the world ignored her. Now she was Colette Drummond, wife, partner, rancher, living a life that was hard and demanding and completely, absolutely hers. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had walked 4 hours in terrible boots and saved a man twice her size from a fallen horse and told him she had already made up her mind and he could either agree or get out of her way. For the first time in her adult life, Colette Weston, now Colette Drummond, felt like she mattered. Outside, the Montana wind howled. Inside, the fire burned steady, and somewhere in the distance a wolf called out to an empty landscape, looking for something it had not found yet. Colette closed her eyes and fell asleep to the sound of it. Winter came early that year. It did not arrive gradually the way seasons are supposed to transition, with a slow cooling and a gentle shortening of days that gives you time to prepare. It arrived the way a fist arrives, all at once, with force, with the clear intention of doing damage. The first real storm hit 3 weeks after the wedding, dropping 2 feet of snow overnight and burying the fence lines under drifts that reached past Colette's waist. She had thought she understood cold. She had been wrong the way a person who has seen a photograph of the ocean is wrong about what it feels like to stand in the surf. Town cold was uncomfortable, inconvenient, the kind that made you walk faster and pull your collar higher and look forward to getting inside. Ranch cold was something else entirely. It was alive, malevolent, a physical force that pressed against the walls of the house and tested every crack and every gap, searching for weakness with the patience of something that had all winter to find it. It got into your bones, got into your thoughts, made you stupid with it, made your fingers clumsy and your mind slow. And if you were not careful, if you let your guard down for even a moment, it killed you, quietly, efficiently, without malice or mercy. Colette woke to Silas shaking her shoulder in the dark. His grip was firm but not rough. "Get dressed, warm as you can. We've got cattle to move." Her brain was still foggy. "Move where?" "Closer to the barn. Storm's getting worse and they're too far out. We lose them in this, we lose half the herd." The urgency in his voice cut through her drowsiness the way a blade cuts through rope. She was dressed and outside in 5 minutes, wearing every piece of clothing she owned, layers stacked on layers, and it was still not enough. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind screamed across the valley, driving snow horizontal, turning the world into a white chaos, where she could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. It was like being inside a scream that had no source and no end, and filled every inch of space until there was nothing else. Silas handed her a rope. "Tie this around your waist. Other end goes to my saddle. You lose sight of me, the rope brings you back." "I thought I was learning to ride." "You are, but not in this." His face was grim. All business. The patient teacher was gone. In his place was the soldier, the man who had survived worse than this and knew exactly how bad it could get. "Stay close. Don't let go of that rope for any reason." She understood. People died in storms like this, walked 10 feet from their house and never found their way back, turned around in the white and walked in circles until the cold took them. The stories were not exaggerations. They were instructions. They worked for 6 hours straight. Silas on horseback pushing the cattle toward the near pasture, his horse picking its way through drifts with the careful determination of an animal that had done this before and would prefer not to do it again, but would because it was asked to. Colette on foot, struggling through hip-deep snow, opening gates and counting heads. Her world reduced to the rope around her waist and the dim shapes of cattle moving through the white like ghosts of animals rather than animals themselves. Her fingers went numb after the first hour. She could not feel them anymore, could not tell whether they were still gripping the fence post or had let go. She had to keep looking down to check, and even then the information her eyes sent to her brain did not match what her hands were or were not doing. Her face felt like someone had taken sandpaper to it. The wind-driven snow hit her exposed skin with a force that was not just cold, but cutting, abrasive, turning her cheeks raw and her lips cracked and her eyes streaming with tears that froze on her face before they could fall. The rope around her waist was the only thing that kept her oriented. When the wind shifted and the snow swirled and direction disappeared entirely, she would feel the tug of it. Silas on the other end, moving, always moving, and she would follow it like a lifeline, which was exactly what it was. When they finally got the last of the cattle secured, Silas practically carried her back to the house. She was shaking so hard she could not work the door latch. Her hands were cramped into claws that would not open, would not obey any signal her brain was sending. Inside, he sat her by the fire and pulled off her boots. Her feet were white, bloodless, the skin waxy and strange like they belonged to someone who was already gone. He swore, one word, quiet and heartfelt. "This is going to hurt," he said, and began massaging feeling back into them. He was right. The pain was excruciating, like needles driving into bone, a fire that started at the tips of her toes and burned its way up through her feet with merciless intensity. Colette bit down on her sleeve to keep from screaming. Her body tried to pull away from his hands, away from the pain, but he held firm, his grip steady and sure. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, not stopping. "But if we don't get circulation back, you lose the toes." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. He worked methodically, each movement precise and purposeful, his scarred hands gentler than she would have believed possible for hands that size, until color started returning, pink, then red, the blood rushing back with a fury that made her gasp. Then he did the same with her hands, each finger individually, watching her face the whole time. "You did good out there," he said, when the worst of it was over. "Better than good. Most people would have frozen up. I was terrified. Being scared and doing it anyway. That's courage." He stood, moved to the stove. "Hot food. Then sleep. We'll check the cattle again in a few hours." Colette watched him work. This man she had married on a practical agreement. And she felt something shift inside her chest. Something tectonic. Something that changed the landscape of her feelings in a way she could not ignore and did not want to. He had trusted her in that storm, had not treated her like she was fragile or incompetent, had not sent her to safety while he handled the danger alone. He had tied a rope around her waist and brought her with him. Because the work required two people and she was his partner, and that was what partners did. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of screaming wind and relentless snow. 3 days during which the ranch contracted to the house and the barn and the narrow path between them. They took turns sleeping, one of them always up, keeping the fire going, monitoring the animals, listening for the particular sound of cattle in distress, a low, mournful bellow that carried even through the howling wind and meant something was wrong. On the second night, a section of the barn roof collapsed. The crack was enormous, like a rifle shot amplified 100 times. It brought them both running through the dark, half-dressed boots, unlaced the snow hitting their faces like thrown gravel. They spent 4 hours in the howling dark, shoveling snow off the remaining roof, patching the hole with canvas and nails, and what Colette was beginning to think of as the primary building material of ranch life, which was hope. Silas worked with a focused intensity that bordered on desperation. This was his barn, his animals, his life's work. Every board he nailed was a refusal to let the storm win. Colette worked beside him, passing tools, holding canvas in place while he secured it, doing whatever needed to be done without waiting to be asked, because waiting to be asked was a luxury that blizzards did not offer. By the time the storm broke on the 4th morning, Colette had stopped feeling her extremities and had started talking to the cattle like they were old friends. It was not a conscious decision. It happened gradually, born of exhaustion and isolation and the human need to hear a voice, even if it was your own, even if the only audience was a 1,000-pound animal that did not understand English and did not care. Silas found her in the barn at dawn, sitting in the straw next to a pregnant heifer, explaining the finer points of baking bread. "And you have to let it rise twice," she was saying, her voice hoarse from 3 days of cold air and no sleep. "First rise is for structure, second is for flavor. People rush it and wonder why their bread tastes like nothing." The heifer mooed. "Exactly," Colette agreed. "Colette." Silas's voice was gentle. She looked up at him. He saw the exhaustion written across her face, dark circles under her eyes, skin pale and drawn, hair plastered to her forehead. But she was smiling. A loopy, exhausted, slightly unhinged smile that somehow made her look younger and more alive than he had ever seen her. "Storm's over," he said. "Thank goodness, I was running out of baking advice." He helped her to her feet. She swayed. He caught her automatically, one arm around her waist. "Easy. When's the last time you ate?" She thought about it. "Yesterday, maybe. Inside, food, sleep. You don't give me orders." "I do when you're dead on your feet and lecturing a cow about yeast." She wanted to argue. She always wanted to argue now. She had discovered during the past weeks that she had a combative streak that Mrs. Pendleton's bakery had beaten into submission, but that the ranch was slowly, steadily coaxing back to life. But her legs chose that moment to stop working. She sagged, and Silas caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her like she weighed nothing. "Put me down," she protested. "I can walk." "You really can't." He carried her into the house and set her in the chair by the fire. She was asleep before he got the coffee boiling. When she woke, it was late afternoon. A plate of food sat on the table beside her. Bread, cheese, cold ham. Simple, but more than she had eaten in days. She devoured it with the desperate intensity of someone who had forgotten what hunger felt like until the food reminded her. Silas was at the table, working on the ranch ledgers. He glanced up when she moved. "Better. Much. We lost 2 head. Could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse. Because we moved them in time. Because we both moved them." He set down his pencil. "When I posted that notice, I thought I'd get someone competent. Someone who already knew the work." He paused. "What I got was someone who walked into a blizzard in bad boots and stayed conscious long enough to count every single head before collapsing from exhaustion." He paused again, like what came next required effort. "You're tougher than you look, Colette. Is that a compliment?" "It's the truth, and yes." Something warm spread through her chest. "You're not so bad yourself. I'm a disaster at saying things like this. Good thing I'm not keeping score." He almost smiled. Almost. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. Less like 2 strangers sharing a roof and more like 2 halves of something that had been waiting to be whole. They worked together, feeding animals, chopping wood, repairing storm damage that seemed to multiply overnight as though winter was a living creature that spent its nights undoing everything they fixed during the day. They ate together, sat by the fire in the evenings while Silas read or worked on his books, and Colette mended clothes or attempted to improve her cooking, which was progressing from terrible to merely bad with occasional detours back to terrible. She learned things about him. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced only when he was tired, arriving without warning and leaving before you could be sure it had been there. He was patient with animals, but had no tolerance for broken equipment. He read history books and had strong opinions about the railroads and the Indian campaigns and the way the government treated its own veterans. He made coffee strong enough to dissolve iron and liked his eggs cooked until they were leather, which Colette found incomprehensible, but accommodated because marriage, she was learning, was partly about accepting the things you could not change and saving your arguments for the things you could. He learned things about her. She had a temper. It showed up when things did not work the way they were supposed to. A flash of frustration that colored her cheeks and produced language that would have scandalized every church lady in Montana Territory. She talked to herself when she was concentrating, was terrified of mice but perfectly calm around snakes, sang while she worked old folk songs and hymns her mother had taught her, usually off-key, and did not seem to realize she was doing it. One evening in late December, Colette was attempting to make stew when the front door crashed open. She spun around, knife in hand, her heart leaping. Silas stood there with something bundled in his coat, snow melting in his hair, his cheeks red, and his expression was something she had never seen on him before, determined and sheepish at the same time. "Don't panic," he said. "Why would I?" He opened his coat. A wolf pup tumbled out, all oversized paws and gray fluff. It looked around the room with bright, curious eyes that seemed to contain the entire spectrum of wonder. "Silas, why is there a baby wolf in our house? Found him near the North Ridge. Mother's dead. Mountain lion got her. Rest of the litter didn't make it." He set the pup down gently. It immediately began investigating the table leg with intense focus. "He's maybe 6 weeks old. Won't survive on his own." "So you brought him here. You said the wolf was just trying to survive, same as us." His expression was challenging, almost defensive, like he expected her to tell him he was being ridiculous and was prepared to argue about it. "Figured you'd want to try." Colette looked at the pup. It was now chewing on the table leg with the single-minded determination of something that intended to bring it down through sheer force of will. Then she looked at Silas, this hard, practical man who had walked miles through snow to rescue something most people would have shot on sight, because of something she had said weeks ago about a wolf on a ridge, because he had listened, because listening had changed the way he saw the world, even if he would never admit it. "We'll need to feed him," she said. "Warm milk, and he'll need a box by the fire." The relief on his face was brief, but unmistakable. "I'll build the box." They named him Ghost because of his coloring, pale gray, almost silver in certain light, like smoke from a chimney or fog rising off a winter field. He became a fixture in the house, a destructive, chaotic, endlessly entertaining fixture that chewed everything he could reach and howled mournfully whenever left alone and knocked over water buckets with a tail that seemed to have its own agenda. He followed Colette everywhere, slept on her feet while she cooked, rode in the saddlebag when they checked cattle, his gray head poking out ears, swiveling nose working. He grew fast. Within a month, the saddlebag could no longer contain him. He trotted alongside the horses instead, his long legs eating up distance with an easy stride that looked effortless because it was. "He thinks you're his mother," Silas observed one morning, watching Ghost attempt to climb Colette's leg while she cooked. "He's confused. Or smart. You feed him. You rescued him. You made me want to." He said it casually, already turning back to his coffee, like the words were nothing special, but they landed heavier than he intended. They settled into Colette's chest and stayed there, warm, persistent. "I didn't make you do anything," she said, her cheeks heating. "No, but you made me think about things differently. That counts." Christmas came quietly. No decorations, no presents, no tree. Just the two of them and the animals and the wind and the endless white world pressing against the windows. But on Christmas morning, Colette woke to find a new pair of boots outside her door. Real boots, well-made, sturdy leather, solid soles, the kind that cost serious money and lasted serious years. They fit like they had been made for her, which she would later learn was because Silas had traced the outline of her old boots while she slept and taken the measurements to a cobbler in town during his last supply run. She found him in the barn, checking on the pregnant heifer. "Thank you," she said, lifting one foot, "but you didn't have to. Your old ones were falling apart. They weren't that bad. They had a hole the size of my fist in the left sole." "That's an exaggeration." "Is it?" She threw a handful of straw at him. He dodged, and for just a moment his face opened up into something boyish, surprised and pleased, like he had forgotten that life could include moments of play. Then he caught himself, sobering. "Merry Christmas, Colette." "Merry Christmas, Silas." January deepened. The town became unreachable. They were truly isolated now, and Colette, who had expected the loneliness to crush her, found instead a contentment she had never experienced. There was something clean about this life, hard but honest, stripped of pretense, no one to perform for, no one to pretend for, just the work and the snow and the evenings by the fire and the steady presence of a man who saw her, actually saw her, not through her, not past her, at her. Late one night, unable to sleep, she found Silas at the kitchen table, going over the books by lamplight, his face lined with fatigue. "Numbers don't add up," he said. "We're short, not dangerous, but enough. Can I help?" He glanced up, surprised. "You know bookkeeping?" "Some. Mrs. Pendleton had me balance the bakery accounts. She didn't trust herself with math." He slid the ledger across the table. Colette sat down, scanned the columns, her eyes moving through rows of figures with focused attention. It took her 20 minutes to find the error. A transposition in the feed, costs that had been carrying forward for 3 months. Simple mistake. Easy to make. Hard to find once it was embedded. "There," she said, pointing. "You wrote 47. Should be 74. Silas stared at the numbers, then at her, and "I've been going over these books for 2 weeks. Fresh eyes. Fresh eyes with a brain that works." He leaned back, wonder crossing his face. "You really can do anything. I can't shoot straight. I can't rope. My biscuits could break a window. Your biscuits are fine. They're like eating gravel. I've had worse." "That's not the compliment you think it is." Something shifted in the air between them, had been shifting for weeks if Colette was honest with herself, building slowly the way pressure builds before a storm, not the sudden crash of infatuation, something deeper, something that had to do with trust and proximity and the particular intimacy of surviving hard things together, of knowing that the person across the table would eat your terrible cooking without complaint and pull you out of a blizzard and bring home a wolf pup because you once said something that mattered. "I keep waiting for you to realize you made a mistake," Silas said, his voice rough. "Coming here, marrying me, this life. I'm not most women." "No." His voice went softer. "You're really not." Weeks passed. February arrived with storms of its own, but they felt less hostile now, more routine. Colette and Silas had found their rhythm, working together during the day with the easy coordination of people who have learned each other's patterns, sitting together in the evenings with a comfort that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with belonging. It was late February when Colette found Silas at the table past midnight, going over plans for spring. She sat down across from him. Their eyes met, and something that had been building for months finally surfaced. "This partnership," Silas said carefully, every word chosen like he was handling something fragile. "It's become more than I expected. You've become more than I expected. What do you think of me as?" "My wife," he said simply. "Not on paper, actually, if you want that." She should have needed more time, more certainty, but she felt perfectly clear, like she had been walking through fog for years and had suddenly emerged into sunlight. "I want that," she said. He closed the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their size, and he kissed her like he had been thinking about it for weeks and had finally been given permission to stop pretending otherwise. She kissed him back, and the spare room stayed empty that night, and every night after. Spring came late and grudging, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch. Colette stood in the doorway watching the thaw, one hand resting on her stomach, where something new and terrifying and wonderful had started making itself known. 2 months along, she figured. Maybe a little more. She had not told Silas yet. Was still working out how to say it. Still working out what it meant for them. For the ranch. For everything. She was still thinking about the words when a rider appeared on the southern ridge. Colette's hand dropped from her stomach. They did not get visitors. Ever. Someone riding out here meant trouble. Silas came out of the barn, saw the rider. His whole body went still, the kind of stillness she had only seen in him once before, during the blizzard, that split second of absolute calm before action. He moved to the house without taking his eyes off the approaching figure, reached inside the door for his rifle. "Inside," he said to Colette. "Who is it?" "Don't know." "Inside." She went, but stood by the window. Ghost pressed against her leg, a low growl building in his chest. He had grown big enough now that the sound was genuinely threatening. The rider was a man, lean and weathered, a face that had been handsome once and had been eroded by time and bad decisions. He sat his horse with the loose-limbed ease of someone who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. He stopped 20 feet from the house, hands visible, empty. "Drummond," he called out. "Been a long time." Silas's rifle stayed level. "Jasper, that's a hell of a greeting for an old friend." "We're not friends. State your business." The man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Can't a man pay a social call?" "Not you, not here. Last chance. Why are you here?" The smile faded. Jasper Nolan pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got something you're going to want to see. About your wife." Inside the house, Colette's blood went cold. She moved closer to the window. "Seems Mrs. Drummond isn't exactly free to marry. Already has a husband, legal and binding." He waved the paper. "Fellow by the name of Everett Marsh, railroad man, worked the Eastern Territories. Claims she ran out on him 5 years back." "That's a lie," Silas said flatly. "These papers look pretty official." Marriage certificate dated 1879, signed by a judge in Pennsylvania. Jasper took a step closer. "Now, I'm not saying your wife is a liar. Maybe she forgot, but the law's the law, and bigamy is a serious charge." Colette's hands were shaking. Everett Marsh. She had not heard that name in 5 years, had prayed she would never hear it again, had buried it so deep she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else, some other woman, some other life. But names do not stay buried. They are patient, they wait, and they always come back. $5,000, Jasper continued smoothly. "And Mr. Marsh forgets he ever heard the name Colette Weston. You keep your wife. He gets compensated. Everybody wins. Except the truth. Truth's expensive, Drummond. You of all people should know that. Get off my land. You're making a mistake. Get off my land. You've got 10 seconds before I start shooting. And Jasper, I don't miss." Jasper stared at him, then shrugged, remounted his horse, rode off slowly, making it clear he was not afraid, making it clear he would be back. Silas stood there until the rider was completely gone. Then he lowered the rifle, his shoulders rigid. Colette opened the door. "Silas." He turned, and the look on his face stopped her, not angry, worse, hurt. "Is it true?" "It's complicated." "That's not an answer." Her throat closed. She had known this moment would come, had rehearsed 1,000 ways to tell him, but standing here now with his eyes boring into her, every prepared word evaporated. "I was married," she said. "Briefly, a long time ago. To Everett Marsh, to a man who called himself that. I was 19. He was—" She stopped, swallowed. He seemed kind at first, said the right things. My mother had just died. I was alone. I believed him. What happened? He showed his real self 3 weeks after the wedding. The kindness was an act. He wanted someone he could control, someone who'd work and never complain and hand over every penny. Her voice cracked. I tried to leave twice. He found me both times. The second time he broke my arm in 3 places and told me if I ran again, he'd make sure I couldn't walk. Silas's face went absolutely still, every emotion draining out of it. How'd you get away? How'd you get— He took a railroad job, went west for a week. I ran. Didn't stop until Montana. Changed my name, stayed invisible. Hoped he'd forget. But he didn't. No. Silence. Heavy. Loaded. I should have told you before we got married, Colette said. Before anything. I know that. But I thought it was buried. I thought I was safe. And I wanted this so badly. Wanted you. Wanted the ranch. Wanted a life that was mine. I convinced myself the past didn't matter. I told you that first day. His voice was rough. No lying. That was the one rule. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the truth. Same difference. It's not. Isn't it? You let me marry you knowing you might be legally bound to another man. The words hit like a slap. Colette stepped back. That's not fair, she whispered. No, none of this is fair. He moved past her toward the door. Where are you going? Out. I need to think. Silas, don't follow me. He left, and Colette stood in the empty house. Ghost whined against her leg. She sank to the floor, buried her face in the wolf's fur, and cried. She had ruined everything. The one good thing she had built, the one honest partnership she had ever known, destroyed by the one thing she had not been honest about. Silas did not come back until after dark. She found him in the barn, sitting in the straw next to the pregnant heifer, the same one she had lectured about bread during the blizzard. She's close, he said without looking up. Probably tonight. Colette sat down a few feet away, maintaining distance. I'm sorry. I know. I was afraid you wouldn't want me if you knew, afraid you'd think I was damaged, too complicated, too much trouble. You think I would have turned you away. I didn't know. We just met. And now I know you would have understood, should have trusted you. The heifer groaned. Her breathing changed. Silas moved closer to the animal, murmuring low and soothing. Then he looked at Colette. You ever help birth a calf? No. Come here. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was an opening, a chance to work side by side again. She moved to where he indicated and he talked her through it. What to watch, when to help, when to let nature handle things. His voice calm and professional. The calf came an hour later, slick and wobbling, shaking its head at the sudden cold, bright world. The heifer began cleaning it immediately. Silas stood, looked at Colette fully for the first time since the argument. I understand why you didn't tell me, he said. You were protecting yourself. You had every reason. But this only works if we're honest. Even when it's hard. Especially then. I know. I promise. No more secrets. His expression hardened slightly. Because we're going to need that honesty. Jasper wasn't bluffing. Marsh is coming. Maybe with fake papers. Maybe real ones. But he's coming. What do? We fight. I know a lawyer in Helena. If there's a legal angle, he'll find it. And nobody takes you anywhere you don't want to go. If the law says, the law isn't always right. You know that better than anyone. He moved closer. The fierce protectiveness in his eyes made her breath catch. You're my wife. The marriage that matters is the one we chose. I'll be damned if I let some con man undo that. Silas, there's something else. She took a breath. I'm pregnant. The silence stretched so long she thought he had not heard. Then his face did something she had never seen before. Shock, wonder, fear, all of it cycling through in seconds. He stood slowly, walked around to her, pulled her to her feet, and held her, his chin on top of her head, his arms solid around her. How long? About 2 months. You're sure? I'm sure. He was quiet. Then, this child is going to grow up free, on this ranch, with both parents, not in some courtroom, not in some stranger's custody, here, ours. You're not angry. Why would I be angry? This is the best news. His hand came to rest on her stomach. Careful, reverent. It changes the stakes, makes everything more urgent, but it doesn't change what we do. They stood like that, wrapped in each other and in the fragile, terrifying hope that they could actually hold this together. Then Ghost barked outside. Sharp, urgent. The warning bark he had developed over the winter, a sound that started in his chest and came out as something that made horses nervous. Silas was moving before the sound finished. Rifle, window, darkness outside. Colette blew out the lamp. Stay back, he murmured. Multiple riders approaching. 4, maybe 5. Moving in formation. Drummond. A voice. Deep. Rough with authority. This is Marshal Caleb Stone. I'm here on official business regarding Colette Marsh, also known as Colette Weston. Come out peaceable and nobody gets hurt. Colette's blood turned to ice. A marshal. Real law. Real authority. Not hired muscle and extortion. The full weight of the federal government riding into their yard in the dark, coming for her. Silas's knuckles were white on the rifle. You got a warrant. Document signed by a federal judge. Colette Marsh is wanted for abandonment of legal marriage and unlawful cohabitation. That good enough? Let me see them. Come out and you can see all you want. Slide them under the door. A pause. Voices conferring, then footsteps. A folded document slid underneath. Silas snatched it up, read it in the moonlight, his face going harder with every line. Well, Colette whispered, it's real. Federal warrant. They can legally compel you to appear before a judge in Pennsylvania. So I have to go. You don't have to do anything. His voice was steel. "But if we fight here, they charge us both with resisting. We lose everything, including the legal high ground." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we go with them. Make it legal. Fight it in court where we can actually win." He looked at her. Despite the hard set of his jaw, his eyes were gentle. "I need you to trust me." Colette thought about running, about grabbing what they could carry and disappearing into the mountains. But that was not a life. That was survival, and she was done just surviving. "I trust you," she said. Silas called out, "We're coming out, but I ride with her. Wherever she goes, I go." "Not how this works, Drummond. That's the deal. Take it or try to arrest us both and see how that goes." Silence. Long and heavy. "Fine, but you cause trouble, you're in chains." They packed in the dark, essentials only. Silas left instructions with Amos Jennings to care for the ranch and the animals. The old man took it without questions, squeezed Silas's shoulder, promised. As they rode out with the marshal and his deputies, Colette looked back at the ranch, their home, the house Silas had built log by log, the barn they had patched together in a blizzard, the pasture where the cattle grazed fat and alive because she and Silas had dragged them through a storm. Everything they had built, everything they had become, growing smaller in the darkness behind her. Silas reached over and took her hand. "We're coming back," he said. "I promise. We're coming back, and we're bringing our child home." Colette squeezed his hand. The mountains rose around them dark and massive against a sky full of stars. Ghost trotted beside the horses, unwilling to be left behind. The marshal's deputies rode ahead, torches flickering their shadows, stretching long across the snow. And Colette Drummond rode east into the unknown with her husband beside her and a child growing inside her, and the only thing she had ever truly owned, which was the decision she had made and the courage to keep making it over and over for as long as it took. The journey east took 20 days. 20 days on horseback and rail cars and stagecoaches that smelled like old leather and unwashed humanity. 20 days of sleeping in roadside inns where the mattresses were thin and the walls were thinner and the sounds of other travelers' lives bled through the gaps between boards like water through a cracked dam. 20 days of eating whatever could be found along the way, hard bread and dried meat and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from something that had once been in the vicinity of a coffee bean, but had since moved on to other ambitions. Marshal Caleb Stone was not a cruel man. He was not a kind one either. He was professional in the particular way that men who carry badges and enforce warrants are professional. He did his job. He made sure his prisoner reached her destination. He treated Colette with a neutral courtesy that somehow felt worse than hostility, because hostility she could have pushed against. Neutrality just reminded her that she was a case number, a warrant, a problem being transported from one jurisdiction to another. Silas stayed beside her. He did not leave her side for the entire journey, not when they rode through rain that turned the roads to mud, not when the stagecoach broke an axle outside a town whose name Colette never learned, and they had to wait 6 hours in the cold for repairs, not when the rail car was so crowded she had to stand for 4 hours, and he gave her his seat and stood over her like a wall between her and the rest of the world. He talked to her when the silence got too heavy, about the ranch, about plans for spring, about whether Ghost would try to eat Amos Jennings' chickens while they were gone. He made her laugh when laughing seemed impossible, with observations about the other passengers that were so dry and precise they caught her off guard, slipping past her fear before she could close the door against them. And he held her at night when the nightmares came. They always came now, dark, formless terrors that woke her gasping, her body rigid, her hands clawing at sheets that were not her sheets, in rooms that were not her room. Everett Marsh's face looming over her in the dark, his voice, the quiet, measured voice he used when he was explaining what would happen if she tried to leave. Not shouting. Everett never shouted. He did not need to. He spoke in a tone that was almost gentle, the way a man might explain something to a child who was too stupid to understand it the first time. And that gentleness was worse than any scream because it made the cruelty seem reasonable, inevitable, deserved. Silas would wrap his arms around her and hold her against his chest until the shaking stopped. He would not say it is okay. He would not say it was just a dream. He would just hold her, solid and warm and real, and wait. Because he understood perhaps better than anyone that some fears could not be talked away. They could only be outlasted. By the time they reached Pennsylvania, Colette was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. She was 4 months pregnant now. The constant motion of travel had left her sick and hollow. Her face was gaunt. Her hands trembled when she tried to hold a cup. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and the child inside her was making its presence known with a persistent nausea that turned every meal into a negotiation between hunger and revolt. The courthouse was a massive stone building, columns and steps and heavy doors that had been designed by someone who understood that architecture could be used as a weapon. Everything about it said authority. Everything about it said power. Everything about it said, you are small and this building is large, and the machinery inside it will process you whether you cooperate or not. Everett Marsh was waiting on the steps. He looked exactly as Colette remembered, which was the worst part. Average height, pleasant face, brown hair neatly combed, clean-shaven, well-dressed in a way that suggested respectability without trying too hard. The kind of man you would walk past on the street without a second glance. The kind of man your mother would approve of. The kind of man who disappeared into crowds and used that invisibility the way other men used fists. When he smiled at her, Colette's hands started shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists and press them against her legs to keep anyone from seeing. "Colette," he said warmly, like they were old friends, like the last 5 years had been a pleasant separation rather than a desperate escape. "It's been too long." Silas stepped between them before Everett could move closer, positioned himself so that his body blocked the line of sight completely. "Stay away from her." Everett's smile did not waver. It never wavered. That was one of his gifts, the ability to maintain a pleasant expression regardless of what was happening behind it. "Is that any way to greet your wife's husband?" "Her husband is standing right here." "The law might disagree." Everett produced a document, held it up like a flag. "Marriage certificate, legal and binding, signed in 1879 by Judge Patterson in Harrisburg. Colette belongs with me, Mr. Drummond, not on some primitive ranch playing house with a man she barely knows." "She knows me better than she ever knew you. Does she?" Everett's voice dropped, became intimate, a poisoned whisper designed to sound like concern. "Did she tell you about her temper, her hysteria, how many times I had to correct her behavior? She's fragile, Mr. Drummond, needs a firm hand. I can provide that. You're just enabling her delusions." Silas's fist connected with Everett's jaw before Colette even saw him move. It was not a calculated strike, not a measured response. It was the raw, unfiltered reaction of a man who had spent 20 days riding east with a woman who woke up screaming because of what this smiling, pleasant-faced creature had done to her, and who had finally come face to face with the source of those screams and discovered that he was not interested in conversation. Everett went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. The deputies moved immediately, grabbing Silas and hauling him back. "That was stupid," the marshal said. "Worth it," Silas replied, breathing hard. Everett climbed to his feet, dabbed at his nose with a handkerchief, still smiling, always smiling. "Assault in front of law enforcement," he said. "That's going to look wonderful in court. Thank you, Mr. Drummond. You just made my case stronger." The trial was set for 3 days later. Silas hired the lawyer he had mentioned during those long nights of planning at the ranch kitchen table, Emmett Shaw, a sharp-eyed man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been assembled from angles rather than curves. He had served as a military attorney before going into private practice, and he approached legal problems the way a general approaches a battlefield, systematically, without sentiment, with the understanding that the objective was victory and everything else was secondary. Shaw listened to their story without interruption. His pen moved steadily across his notepad. His expression remained neutral throughout, even during the parts that made Colette's voice crack and her hands shake. When they finished, he examined the documents: the marriage certificate, the federal warrant, the carefully constructed paper trail that Everett had assembled. "The certificate appears legitimate," Shaw said. "If it stands, you're technically guilty of bigamy. That's a criminal offense in this jurisdiction." "Even though I was coerced?" Colette asked. "Proving coercion 5 years after the fact is difficult. Your word against his. Judges favor documented evidence over testimony." Shaw leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "However, there may be another approach." "Which is?" Silas asked. "Pattern. If Marsh has done this before, if we can establish a history of predatory behavior, then the narrative shifts. He's not a wronged husband seeking his wife. He's a confidence man running a scheme, and the scheme is the crime, not the escape. In 3 days. It's what we have, so we use every minute." They worked through the night, Shaw sending telegrams to contacts across 3 states, making inquiries at courthouses and police stations, pulling on every thread available. Colette and Silas dug through everything she could remember about Everett: names of people he had mentioned, places he claimed to have worked, details of his railroad employment that might or might not have been real, addresses, dates, the fragments of a life that might have been entirely fabricated. On the 2nd day, Shaw came back with news, and the controlled intensity in his voice told Colette that whatever he had found was significant. "2 women," he said, "both married to a man matching Marsh's description. Both marriages within the same period as yours. Both women filed complaints for fraud before the man disappeared. Hope, for the first time since leaving Montana. Small and fragile like a flame cupped in cold hands. He's done this before, extensively. He targets vulnerable women, widows, orphans, women without family or resources, marries them legally, takes control of their assets and earnings, moves on when there's nothing left." Shaw paused. "The pattern goes back at least a decade. Can we use this if I can get testimony, but finding these women, getting them here in time?" He shook his head. "It's going to be close." On the morning of the trial, 1 woman arrived. Her name was Lillian Fossey. She was thin in the way people are thin when they have not eaten enough for a very long time, not recently, but at some point in their past, and the memory of that hunger has never fully left their body. She was nervous, watchful. She had the particular stillness of someone who had learned through hard experience that the world contained dangers that looked like kindness and sounded like love and smiled while they destroyed you. She was terrified of being in the same room as Everett Marsh, but she had come, had traveled from Ohio on her own money, which she did not have much of, had come because Shaw's telegram had found her at exactly the right moment when she was strong enough to face what she had survived and angry enough to want to make sure it did not happen to anyone else. "He did the same to me," Lillian told Shaw in a voice that shook but did not break. "Married me in 1878, took everything, my savings, my mother's jewelry. When I confronted him, he made it clear I was not to question him." Her hand went to her upper arm, touching a spot where something had happened that left a mark, visible or otherwise. "He didn't shout. He never shouted. He just explained very calmly what would happen if I didn't cooperate." Colette closed her eyes. She knew that voice, that calm, that reasonable, measured tone that turned violence into something that sounded like a lesson. "Nobody should go through what we went through," Lillian said. She looked at Colette, and something passed between them. Recognition. Solidarity. The particular bond of women who had survived the same predator and lived to tell about it. "If telling my story stops him, I'll tell it as many times as they need to hear it." The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the case the way word always spreads about cases that involve scandal and money and the possibility of watching someone's life fall apart in public. The gallery benches were full. People stood along the walls. They craned their necks and whispered to each other and settled in with the particular anticipation of an audience that expected to be entertained. Everett Marsh sat at the plaintiff's table looking confident, sympathetic. He had dressed for the occasion, dark suit, white shirt, carefully knotted tie. He looked respectable, concerned. The picture of a wronged husband seeking justice through proper channels, a man who had suffered the abandonment of his wife and had turned to the law rather than to violence because he was civilized and patient and believed in the system. His lawyer was a smooth-talking man from Philadelphia who specialized in domestic cases and had built a career on making complicated things sound simple when simplicity served his client and making simple things sound complicated when complexity served his client better. Colette sat beside Shaw, trying not to shake, her hands clenched in her lap. She was wearing the blue dress she had sewn by lamplight in the ranch house from fabric she had bought in town. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and home and the particular clean scent of Montana winter, and she held on to that smell the way she had held on to the rope around her waist during the blizzard as a lifeline, as proof that she had a life to get back to. Silas sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence without turning around, an anchor in a room that was trying to sweep her away. Judge Whitmore was an older man with the kind of authority that comes from decades of sitting in judgment on other people's choices. He called the court to order and listened while Everett's lawyer presented the case. It was compelling. Colette had to admit that. The lawyer painted Everett as a devoted husband, patient, long-suffering, a man who had searched for years to find the wife who had abandoned him without explanation. He produced the marriage certificate, the witnesses, the paper trail showing that Colette Weston had married Everett Marsh on May 14, 1879 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and had subsequently vanished. "My client seeks only what any husband would seek," the lawyer concluded. The recognition of his legal rights and the acknowledgement that Mrs. Drummond, or more properly, Mrs. Marsh, entered into a second marriage while her first remained in force. This is bigamy. It is a crime. The court must act accordingly. Then it was Shaw's turn. He started methodically, walking the judge through the timeline, the marriage, the abuse, the escape, building the case brick by brick the way you build a wall that needs to hold against a flood. Then Shaw turned to Colette. "Your Honor, my client wishes to testify on her own behalf." Shaw had not wanted this. He had argued against it the night before, pacing the small room they had rented, laying out the risks. Testimony was unpredictable. Everett's lawyer would cross-examine her. He would try to make her look unstable, hysterical, exactly the kind of woman Everett had described. It was safer to let the evidence speak, to rely on Lillian's testimony and the documents Shaw had gathered. But Colette had been clear. "I spent 5 years being silent," she said. 5 years hiding, running, making myself invisible because I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke. I am done being silent. I am done being invisible. If this court is going to decide my future, it's going to hear my voice, not my lawyer's voice, not my husband's voice, mine. Silas had looked at her when she said it, and something in his expression, pride and fear and love, and the particular respect of a man who recognized courage because he had spent his life in its company, told her that he understood, that he would not try to stop her, that he trusted her to do this the way she had trusted him to bring her here. She took the stand. The courtroom was very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people simultaneously stop breathing and wait for something to break. Colette looked at Everett Marsh. He was watching her with that smile, that pleasant, patient, reasonable smile that she had once believed was kindness and had later learned was a mask worn by something that did not know how to feel kindness, but had studied it carefully enough to imitate the shape. She looked away from him, looked at the judge, and began to speak. She did not tell the story the way a victim tells it. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She did not describe the violence first, though she would get to that. Instead, she began with the system, the architecture of control that Everett had built around her brick by careful brick, until she was trapped inside it so completely that she could not see the walls. "He started by isolating me," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, the voice of a woman who had spent weeks crossing a continent to be here and was not going to waste the opportunity. "Within a month of the marriage, I had no contact with anyone outside our home. He told me my friends were bad influences, that my neighbors were gossiping about me, that the only person I could trust was him, and I believed him because I was 19 and my mother had just died and I was alone and he was the only person in the world who was paying attention to me." She paused, let the words settle. "Then he took control of the money. Every penny I earned went to him. He gave me an allowance for household expenses and required an accounting of every cent. If I spent more than he expected, he would explain very calmly that I was being irresponsible, that I could not be trusted, that he was managing the finances for my own protection because I was not capable of doing it myself." The courtroom was listening, not with the prurient hunger of people expecting scandal, but with something deeper, something that had shifted. Then came the rules, what I could wear, where I could go, who I could speak to, when I could leave the house, which was almost never. Each rule was presented as reasonable, as something a loving husband would naturally expect, and if I questioned any of them, he would not shout. He never shouted. She looked at Everett then, held his gaze. He would explain, in that calm, patient voice, the voice you are hearing now when he speaks to the court, that reasonable, gentle tone. He would explain what would happen if I did not comply, and then he would follow through, not in anger, never in anger. In the same calm, measured way he explained everything, as though the violence was simply the logical consequence of my failure to understand. The judge's expression had changed. The professional neutrality was still there, but something behind it had shifted. A hardening around the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. "He broke my arm in 3 places," Colette said. "On the second occasion I tried to leave. He said it himself because a doctor would have asked questions. He told me that if I tried again he would make sure I could not walk, and I believed him, because by that point I believed everything he said. He had spent months making sure of that." She straightened in the chair. "Mr. Marsh's lawyer described me as a wife who abandoned her husband. That is not what happened. What happened is that a prisoner escaped, and the man who imprisoned her has spent 5 years trying to get her back, not because he loves her, not because he misses her, but because she is his property, and he does not accept the loss of property." The courtroom erupted, not with shock, with recognition. The sound people make when something they suspected has been confirmed, when the shape they had been trying to see in the dark is suddenly illuminated and turns out to be exactly what they feared. Everett's lawyer objected, repeatedly. Colette's testimony was emotional, unsubstantiated, inflammatory. Judge Whitmore overruled him each time. He was watching Colette with the focused attention of a man who was recalculating everything he thought he knew about this case. Everett's lawyer cross-examined her, tried to make her contradict herself, tried to find cracks in the calm, precise account she had given, suggested that her memory was unreliable, that she was exaggerating, that a woman who had truly been abused would not be able to speak about it so clearly. "I speak clearly because I have had 5 years to understand what happened to me," Colette said. 5 years to take apart every moment and examine it and name it for what it was. I was not hysterical then, and I am not hysterical now. I was controlled. There is a difference. The lawyer sat down. He did not look confident anymore. Then Shaw called Lillian Fossey to the stand. Lillian told her story in a quiet voice. How Everett had courted her in Ohio, married her quickly, before she had time to think, before she could ask questions, how he had taken her savings, her inheritance, her sense of safety, how he had used the same calm, reasonable voice to explain the same rules and enforce the same consequences. The details were identical. The isolation, the financial control, the escalating restrictions, the violence presented as correction, the gentleness of the voice that delivered threats. 2 women, 2 states, 2 years apart. The same story told twice. Then Shaw produced the documents. 4 marriage certificates, all signed within a 2-year period, all bearing the name Everett Marsh, though the handwriting on the signatures varied in ways that suggested they might not all have been written by the same man, all witnessed by the same 2 individuals, all certified by the same judge. Judge Albert Patterson of Harrisburg, who had already been subpoenaed and who had admitted under separate questioning that Marsh had paid him $300 for each signature. Shaw laid the certificates on the judge's bench, one beside the other. 4 marriages, 4 women, 4 sets of promises made and broken. "Which marriage is the real one, Your Honor?" Shaw asked the courtroom. His voice carried through the silence like a bell. "If Everett Marsh married 4 women within 24 months, which one counts? Are all 4 women guilty of bigamy, or is Mr. Marsh the one committing fraud?" Everett's mask cracked. It did not shatter. Men like Everett do not shatter. They are too practiced for that. But the pleasant smile faltered. The calm, reasonable expression shifted. And for a moment, just a moment, something else showed through. Fury. The cold, calculated fury of a man who has lost control of a situation he believed he had managed perfectly. "This is absurd," Everett started. "You will have your opportunity to respond," Judge Whitmore said sharply. But the opportunity, when it came, did not help. Everett's answers became defensive, tangled. The smooth confidence that had characterized his opening presentation dissolved into contradictions that even his polished lawyer could not smooth over. He denied knowing Lillian Fossey and was confronted with a letter in his own handwriting addressed to her. He claimed the other marriage certificates were forgeries and could not explain why they bore the same judge's seal. He insisted that Colette had left voluntarily and could not account for the medical evidence of a fracture to her left arm that had healed without proper setting. When Silas took the stand, the courtroom shifted again. He filled the witness box the way he filled every space he occupied completely. His deep voice was steady. His account was simple. He described finding Colette, half-starved, working herself to death for pennies, sleeping in a storage room, invisible. He described the woman she had become on the ranch, the blizzard, the fallen horse, the night she had run his operation alone while he could not walk. "She never mentioned Marsh," Silas said. "Not once. Not because she was hiding something, because she was terrified. Because this man had taught her that the only way to survive was to disappear, and she had disappeared so completely that even her own past could not find her." He paused, looked at Everett, until he came looking. The verdict came down the next day. Charges dismissed. All of them. The judge's ruling was direct and left no room for ambiguity. Colette Weston now. Colette Drummond had entered her first marriage under conditions that constituted coercion and fraud. The marriage to Everett Marsh was declared invalid on the grounds that the officiant who performed it had been paid to do so as part of a criminal enterprise. Her marriage to Silas Drummond was affirmed as the sole legal union. Everett Marsh was arrested. Multiple counts of fraud, coercion, corruption of a public official. The judge who had signed the certificates was stripped of his position. The two witnesses were being sought for questioning. Everett was led away in handcuffs. He did not look at Colette as he passed. He did not need to. She was looking at him, watching him go, watching the pleasant face and the calm demeanor and the reasonable, measured way he moved even now, even in defeat, even in chains. She watched him disappear through a door that closed behind him with a sound that was not dramatic, was not final in any cinematic way. It was just a door closing, the way doors do. But it was enough. Colette walked out of that courthouse into sunlight. The steps were wide and white, and the sky above them was the particular blue that the East Coast manages in late spring, bright and clean and full of the kind of promise that skies make and sometimes keep. She sat down on the steps, because her knees would not hold her anymore, because the thing she had been carrying for 5 years, the fear, the weight of it, the constant vigilance that had become so much a part of her that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it, had suddenly lifted. And the absence of it was so disorienting that she needed to sit down and remember how to breathe without it. Silas sat beside her, not touching, just present. "It's over," she said. "It's over. We can go home. We can go home." She turned to him, and the look on his face, pride and relief and love and exhaustion and something she could only describe as awe, The awe of a man who had just watched the woman he loved stand up in front of a room full of strangers and tear apart the monster who had tried to destroy her, using nothing but her voice, and the truth that look broke something open inside her that she had been holding shut for a very long time. She started crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had learned to produce during the years with Everett, the silent kind that left no evidence. These were loud, messy, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and refused to be managed or minimized or hidden. Silas pulled her close, let her sob against his chest while people walked past and stared, and he did not care at all. Not about the stares, not about the spectacle, not about anything except the woman in his arms and the fact that she was safe and free and his and crying because she finally could. When she could breathe again, she pulled back and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for bringing me here, for sitting behind me in that courtroom." "Always," Silas said, "for as long as we both live. I need you to know something." She took his hand, placed it on her stomach. "This child is going to know what happened. When she's old enough, she's going to know that her mother was afraid, and that her mother did it anyway, and that her father rode 20 days across a continent because he made a promise, and he keeps his promises." Silas's hand pressed gently against her stomach. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough. "I think so. Just a feeling. She's going to be just like you. God help us all." He almost smiled. Almost. They left Pennsylvania the next morning and did not look back. The journey home was longer than the journey east, partly because they were not being hurried by a martial schedule, partly because Colette was 4 months pregnant, and the jostling of trains and stagecoaches left her sick and drained, but mostly because neither of them was in a rush anymore. The threat was gone. Everett was facing his own reckoning. They were free, actually truly completely free. They stopped in Nebraska to rest, a small town above a saloon. 3 days while Colette recovered her strength. On the last night she found Silas at the window looking out at the moonlit street. "Worried?" she asked. "Thinking about what kind of father I'll be?" His voice was low. "I've been alone my whole adult life. I know how to survive. But a family, that's different." "We don't have to be perfect," Colette said. "We just have to try. And when we mess up, we fix it, same as everything else." "When did you get so wise?" "About 5 minutes ago. Don't expect it to last." They reached the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. The place was standing, the fences intact, the cattle grazing. Ghost came bounding from the barn and nearly knocked Colette over with his enthusiasm. Amos Jennings appeared behind him grinning. "About time," the old man said. "How bad is it?" "Nothing that can't be fixed. Your place is solid Drummond, built to last." Amos's daughter Nettie had been helping with the house. She had left preserves and bread and a kitchen that was cleaner than Colette had ever managed. The kindness of it made her throat tight. "Neighborly," Nettie said when Colette thanked her. "That's what we do out here." That night in their own bed for the first time in 2 months, Colette stared at the ceiling and felt peace. Not the absence of fear, something more active than that. The presence of safety, the knowledge that she was where she belonged, that the walls around her had been built by the man beside her, log by log, by hand, and they would hold. The months that followed were a rhythm of preparation, working the ranch, repairing what had broken, getting ready for winter and for a child. Silas built a cradle in the evenings, working by lamplight with careful precision. He carved a small wolf into the headboard. Colette sewed baby clothes from fabric she had bought in town and tried not to think about how small they were. Nettie came twice a week, ostensibly to help with heavy work, really because she had become something like a friend. She taught Colette things her own mother had not lived long enough to teach: how to preserve food, how to make soap, which plants were medicine and which were poison. "You're doing good," Nettie said one afternoon. "Most women from back east can't adapt, but you've got the spine for this life." "I don't feel like I do." "That's just being human. The trick is doing it anyway." On December 20th, Colette woke in the middle of the night with a pain that stole her breath. Silas was up instantly, lamps lit, fire stoked. He rode for Nettie and the midwife, an old woman named Agnes, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and breathing, and Nettie's calm voice and Silas's hand in hers, which she gripped hard enough to leave bruises that he would carry for a week and never mention. Dawn was breaking when Agnes said, "Next one you push." Colette pushed, until she thought she might break apart, until the world narrowed to nothing but effort and pain and the desperate animal need to bring this child into the light. A cry, thin, outraged, perfect. "Girl," Agnes said. "Healthy lungs." She placed the baby in Colette's arms. And the world, which had been so large and so dangerous and so full of things that could hurt you, contracted to the size of a small red face and two tiny fists and a pair of eyes that were trying very hard to focus on something and had not yet figured out what. Silas leaned over them both. His expression was something Colette had never seen on him before. Stripped bare, unguarded. The walls he had spent decades building, the walls that protected him from the world and the world from whatever he carried inside him, were gone, just gone. And what was behind them was wonder. "She's so small," he said. "She's perfect." "What's her name?" Colette looked at her daughter, at the tiny face that was already arranging itself into an expression of determined dissatisfaction with the temperature of the room. "Louisa," she said. "After my mother. Louisa Drummond." He reached out, touched the baby's hand. She gripped his finger with a strength that seemed impossible for something that small, and Colette watched his face change in a way that could not be changed back. "I'm going to be terrible at this," he said. "You're going to be wonderful." "How do you know?" "Because you're already worried about getting it right. Bad fathers don't worry." He kissed her forehead, then Louisa's. And the three of them stayed like that, in the lamplight, in the warmth in the house that Silas had built and Colette had made into a home, while outside the Montana winter pressed against the windows and could not get in. The years unfolded the way years do when they are lived rather than endured. Not easily, not without struggle, but with purpose, with direction, with the particular forward momentum that comes from two people pulling in the same direction. Louisa grew. A second daughter arrived 2 years later, a quiet child named Nell, who had Silas's eyes and watched the world with a gravity that suggested she was taking notes. 2 years after that, a son, Samuel, loud from his first breath and apparently committed to remaining so. The ranch expanded, more land, more cattle, hired hands, a bigger barn, a proper house with separate rooms and a kitchen that made Colette stand in the doorway the first time she used it, overwhelmed by the simple fact of having a space that was hers, designed for her work, built by a man who understood that her work had value. Colette learned to manage the books, to negotiate prices with buyers who tried to cheat her because she was a woman, and learned quickly that cheating Colette Drummond was an error you only made once. She built a reputation for fairness and precision that extended beyond the ranch until other operations in the territory were asking her advice on their own finances. Silas built a reputation for quality: his cattle, his horses, his fencing that ran straight, and his word that held firm. Together they became something the community could not ignore: a force, a family, a name that meant something. Everett Marsh died in prison when Louisa was 7, killed in a fight with another inmate. Colette heard about it months after it happened and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief. Just the quiet acknowledgement that a door she had closed years ago had now been sealed shut by someone else. When Louisa was 15, Vivian Hale appeared at the ranch. She was thinner than Colette remembered, her expensive dress hanging loose, her eyes hollow in the particular way that Colette recognized immediately because she had seen that look in her own mirror once years ago in another life. "I need help," Vivian said, standing on the porch, no companions flanking her, no sharp smile, no cruel words. Just a woman who had run out of options and come to the last door she could think of knocking on. "My husband is not a good man. I need to leave. I don't have anywhere to go." Colette could have turned her away. She could have reminded Vivian of every whispered insult, every public humiliation, every time Vivian had called her desperate and pathetic and laughed while doing it. Part of her wanted to. The part that still remembered standing in the cold outside Harker's general store, invisible, and mocked while Vivian's laughter cut through the morning air like broken glass. But Colette had learned something about cruelty over the past 15 years. She had learned that it was a chain, that it passed from hand to hand and generation to generation, and the only way to break it was to choose deliberately and with full awareness of the cost not to pass it on. She stepped aside. "Stay as long as you need," she said. "We'll figure it out." Vivian stayed 3 months. Her soft hands blistered and bled and formed calluses. She learned to cook, badly but with determination. She learned to ride. Louisa taught her patiently the way Silas had once taught Colette. When Vivian left for California, where a cousin had offered her a fresh start, she stood on the porch and looked at Colette with eyes that were clear for the first time since she had arrived. "Thank you," she said, "for not being what I deserved. We're all just trying to survive." "No." Vivian's voice was quiet. "You're doing more than surviving. You're living, on your own terms. That's what I want to find." "Then go find it." Years later, Colette heard that Vivian had opened a boarding house in San Francisco for women starting over. She had never remarried. She had built a life that belonged to no one but herself. On their 20th anniversary, the real one, the second wedding, Colette and Silas rode up to the ridge overlooking the ranch, the place where 20 years ago Colette had first seen the valley and the house and the fencing and the cattle, and had almost turned around and run because she could not believe that someone like her deserved something like this. Below them, the ranch spread across the valley like proof. 5,000 acres, 400 head, 3 children, a life built from $4 and a pair of terrible boots, and the willingness to walk into the unknown and keep walking until the unknown became home. Louisa was 19 now, running the horse operation with a competence that would have impressed her father if he were capable of being impressed, which he was constantly, though he expressed it primarily through nods. Nell was 17, managing the books, already better at it than Colette. Samuel was 15, still loud, still chaotic, the kind of young man who would either build something extraordinary or burn something down, and possibly both. "Think they'll keep it going?" Colette asked. "After we're gone?" Louisa will. She's got it in her blood. Silas paused. Nell will make sure the money works, and Samuel will keep things interesting. Silence. The good kind. The kind that exists between people who have said everything that matters and are comfortable with the fact that most of what matters does not need to be said at all. You ever regret it? Silas asked. Answering that notice? Not once. Not even during the trial, especially not during the trial. She looked at him. That was the day I stopped being invisible. Not when I walked up to this ranch. Not when I married you. The day I stood up in that courtroom and said the words I had been carrying for 5 years. That was the day I became real. He reached over, took her hand, scarred and calloused and strong. You were always real, Colette. The world just took a while to notice. She leaned against him. His arm came around her shoulders. Below them, lights were coming on in the house. Their children moving through rooms that Silas had built, and Colette had filled with warmth and noise and the particular kind of chaos that only families can produce. Ghost, ancient, now gray, muzzled and slow, lay on the porch, still keeping watch, still guarding the door. I love you, she said. I love you too. He pulled her closer. Thank you for walking up to a stranger's ranch with $4 in boots that were held together with hope. Thank you for letting me stay. They sat there as the sun went down, the sky turning orange, then pink, then purple, then the deep blue that comes just before the stars emerge one by one, like promises being kept. Colette Weston had started with nothing, had been invisible, desperate, dismissed, a woman that the world looked through rather than at. She had walked into danger because the alternative was worse, had chosen uncertainty over the slow death of certainty, had demanded better, not from anyone else, from herself, and she had won. Not because life had been easy, not because the struggle had ended, not because there had not been moments, many of them, when everything seemed ready to collapse, and the only thing holding it together was stubbornness and the refusal to let go of someone else's hand. She had won because she had chosen. Over and over, every day, the same choice: to stay, to work, to trust, to build, to love someone who loved her back in a way that was not pretty or poetic but was honest and solid and real. The way a house built log by log is real. The way a ranch carved from wilderness is real. The way a life assembled from nothing by two people who refuse to give up is the most real thing there is. The stars came out, bright and endless. The Montana sky doing what it does best, reminding you how small you are and how much that smallness can hold. Inside the house, dinner was ready. Their children were waiting. The fire was burning. And Colette Drummond, who had once been invisible, sat on a ridge above the life she had built and let herself feel the full, terrifying, magnificent weight of what it meant to matter. Not because someone had given her permission, because she had taken it herself.